Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. Welcome here in person and welcome our audience online. My name is Jorrit de Jong. I'm the faculty director of the Bloomberg Center for Cities here at Harvard University. We are a university-wide center dedicated to the science and practice of urban problem solving. And we have events like today's to bring together people who are excellent researchers and people who are excellent public leaders. And it is my pleasure to introduce two fine examples of each category. Mayor Abdullah Hammoud from Dearborn, Michigan, and Professor Gordon Hanson here from the Kennedy School of Government, who is also the academic dean of the school. We have worked over the past 10 years with 350 cities worldwide on a variety of issues that city leaders are facing. And economic development has always been in the top 3 priorities of the mayors we've worked with. And they've shared with us that very often the efforts to do something about inclusive growth and pursuit of shared prosperity is fragmented. It's spread across different funding streams, departments, and sectors. And it's hard to really develop a thoughtful strategy that fits the local context. And workforce development is a big part of that. Now, we have worked with Dearborn, Michigan, and Mayor Abdullah Hammoud's leadership has been focused on developing a much more strategic vision of what economic development in Michigan can look like. And I'm not going to spoil all the great stories that the mayor will share himself, but it's fascinating to learn from what's happening in practice on the ground. And to situate that work in a larger context of economic development and scholarship on resilience, workforce resilience in the face of global shocks. We have Professor Gordon Hanson, who is a leading economist, whose work has focused on reimagining the economy, which in fact is the name of an initiative that he co-directs with Professor Danny Roderick. Gordon will also introduce some research-based insights and a new data visualization platform that gives insight at a much more granular level than ever before, what the local funding streams and economic developments might look like and how that can inform practice. So I'm looking forward to hearing this exchange of ideas, to hearing how the lessons learned on the ground and the challenges that you're navigating in practice collide or enhance the ideas that come from empirical research and new ways to think about the economy. Before we get started, I have a few housekeeping announcements. First of all, if you have a question, I have great news. You can ask your question, but please make sure it is a question and it is short, and you briefly introduce yourself. If you are here in person, just raise your hand and somebody with a microphone will appear. And if you are online, there is a Q&A button on your screen somewhere, and if you click on it, you can submit your question. And again, make sure that that's a short question that can be easily brought into the conversation. And then Gordon will alternate between questions from the room and questions from the Zoom. The other housekeeping announcement is, in case of an emergency, please leave calmly through the entrance through which you came in or through another exit here to my right. Finally, I want to make sure everybody understands this event is being recorded for asynchronous use later. So if you do not want to be recorded, don't ask a question during the event, but come to us later. And finally, I want to thank our sponsors, the Reimagining the Economy Project and the Malcolm Wiener Center for Social Policy, as well as Bloomberg Philanthropies. And with that, please join me in welcoming Mayor Abdullah Hammoud and Professor Gordon Hanson.
Thank you very much, Jorrit. It's really a pleasure to be here today, and it's doubly a pleasure to be here with Mayor Hammoud to discuss how we think about economic resilience and the role of workforce development in that resilience in the context of Dearborn, Michigan, a city whose history and whose future is intertwined with Ford Motor Company, in which a city saw itself perhaps in early stages as being dependent on the company, and now the company realizes that it's dependent on Dearborn for its economic future. And I'm excited to talk about the many innovative things that you all are doing on the workforce front. I wanted to spend just a couple of minutes to set the stage to think about the context in which we're thinking about economic resilience and why workforce development is so important. We've learned in the United States over the last 45 years that economic inequality is a force that is driven by that has myriad origins and has created an environment in which we suffer from an absence of good jobs, in particular for individuals who do not attain a four-year college degree. And so creating opportunities for job creation for middle-skilled workers and lower-skilled workers is essential for our economic future, but also for the social fabric of our nation. The fraying of that fabric, the political polarization that we've seen arise, can be traced in part to the weakening of economic opportunity and pathways forward for much of our country. When we think about creating good jobs, who are we talking about? We're thinking about three groups of folks: disadvantaged youth. Folks may come from families in which their parents graduated from high school only or did not graduate from high school at all, may live in environments where they're not seeing opportunities to higher wage occupations. Displaced workers, people who are in transition from one industry to another because their industry has fallen on hard times. You think about in the context of Dearborn, Michigan, there have been periods where the auto industry has been in peril, and you have workers who were then pushed out of employment temporarily or for extended periods of time, and thinking about how do people who had high wage jobs then transition into something that is equally attractive. And now increasingly the challenge of career transitions as emerging technologies dramatically change the occupational landscape. But then the way we organize our lives often invites multiple transitions over the course of our careers. As parents enter and leave the labor force and need to figure out how to insert themselves in an environment that might have been very different from the one that they left. What we have learned in terms of economic research is that at those moments of transition, people can get lost. You can go from having prospects for high wage growth to prospects of just being stuck in low wage employment opportunities. And that's where workforce development comes in. I think of workforce development as career and technical education that builds skills, helps people identify careers, assists in job finding, with an emphasis on local workers and an emphasis also on individuals who are probably not going to get a four-year college degree. In the United States today, community colleges are the overwhelming source of that career and technical education. They have the advantage of being almost everywhere. And almost every major and medium-sized urban city has a community college of some kind. Because of their connection to where they are, their embeddedness in communities gives them a sense of the challenges that those communities face and how you imagine solutions to those challenges. And that localness also means a connection to employers. And that gives them an advantage for thinking about how we imagine workforce development in concert with businesses that are in a particular place. So to set up our discussion, I want to highlight three challenges that we have learned regarding workforce development as it's imparted by community colleges in the United States through the research that we've been doing in the Reimagining the Economy project. Challenge number one is a mismatch between demand and supply. When do people want career and technical training? Typically, when unemployment rates surge. That's when people are more likely to be making career transitions. And we see this very clearly in the data. Enrollment in community colleges goes up sharply when we see spikes in local unemployment. And that's particularly true for individuals in their 30s and 40s. Funding isn't organized like that. Tuition only accounts for 15 to 20% of revenues in community colleges, and they are overwhelmingly dependent on states and local governments for their revenues, and those revenues come from local taxes, and those local taxes tend to take a hit when unemployment rises. So even though we have a program we strongly want to be counter-cyclical, in practice it's not. So that thinking about how we change funding formulas is forefront on the agenda. A second challenge is that even though there's recognition that to do workforce development right, it involves training providers and employers working close together, and almost everybody talks the talk of employer engagement, what you see in practice is enormous variation of what employer engagement actually looks like. We have a group of community colleges, and we're going to learn about Henry Ford Community College and their engagement with local employers in the Dearborn context, that show us how to do that engagement well. What we need are models for diffusion of that practice across a much wider swath of the United States labor force, so that we can then tune the training that community colleges are providing to local economic needs. And then third, what we have is a challenge of slowness of innovation. And by innovation, I mean leaving behind things that are stale, areas of training that the economy no longer demands, and moving on to do new things. Now, this is a little bit odd for a university professor to say this, because what are hotbeds of the absence of innovation when it comes to new educational programs is four-year universities. And community colleges are much better at designing and implementing new programs as need arises. But even still, what we see is a slowness in developing new career and technical pathways as occupations shift. This in part can be traced back to funding models for community colleges. Community colleges are typically funded, not everywhere, but in a preponderance of cases, simply based on enrollment. How many full-time enrollees do you have? Not based on outcomes for individuals. This is beginning to change. Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta has been doing work for the past decade to identify community colleges nationally that operate in systems that have begun to reward performance in terms of career outcomes for enrollees. But states have been slow to adopt this approach. In an environment in which AI seems to have the potential to disrupt everything, retuning the nature of career and technical education is going to be tremendously important. So with that, what we're going to do is the mayor and I are going to have a conversation about the context in Dearborn, innovative things that they have done to build resilience through their approaches to workforce development, and then also talk about the challenges that the community faces. And then we'll turn it all to you all for questions. So be developing your questions over the next couple of minutes. Thank you very much. So, Mayor Hammoud, it's great to have this chance to talk and to learn more about the Dearborn experience. I wonder if we could just start off by getting your thoughts on kind of the challenges of workforce development that are specific to Dearborn, given your this idiosyncratic feature that you have. You've been bound up with the future of the Ford Motor Company for the better part of a century.
Of course. Good afternoon, everyone. Let me start by giving you a background on Dearborn, if you're not familiar. How many of you have heard of Dearborn, Michigan before? Okay, hopefully not on Fox News. So Dearborn is a city of roughly 110,000 people. 50% of our residents are foreign-born. We're almost 10 years younger than the state average. We are home to the third largest school district in the state of Michigan, roughly 20,000 students and counting. The fastest growing age group are actually those under the age of 4. And we are the only school district in Michigan where our local school board sits over both the Henry Ford Community College and the K-12 school system, providing them a unique opportunity to work collaboratively together. And so what it's done for us from a workforce perspective is, I graduated some 20 years ago from high school, but even at that time, dual enrollment was very common. The majority of our students were offered an opportunity to complete a year of college at no expense to them. And now it's actually become a little bit more structured where we have a 4+1 program. So in 5 years through our early college program, you graduate not only with a high school diploma, but also an associate's degree at no expense to you. And what's beautiful about Dearborn is our Henry Ford College campus is also next door to University of Michigan Dearborn. And so they also have now signed agreements over the last 4 years saying it's a free transfer and all credits will be accepted upon completion of your associate's degree, eliminating any time and expense and any barriers that often existed for a community which has a wide range of individuals based on socioeconomic status. From a workforce development perspective, especially in a high immigrant community, it was always that question of, what do I do next, knowing that nobody came before me and has done it. I'm the son of 2 parents who immigrated to America in the 70s and 80s. Neither one of my parents had anything more than a high school education. So when I went to University of Michigan Dearborn for undergrad, it was because U of M Dearborn came for on-site admissions at my high school. I got accepted. I couldn't afford the college application, and that's just where I ultimately ended up going. And so we really work hard on eliminating those barriers. The idea of an application fee, the idea of an application altogether, the idea of having to determine which of my college credits will transfer during my dual enrollment period. So all that helps feed into kind of eliminating the bureaucracy that exists and getting folks out to the workforce. We're a city where almost 95% graduation rate within our high school. Yet only about 80% of those who graduate actually go on to a 4-year institution. 20% do not. We lose them most oftentimes than not to small businesses or working within a family business, whatever it might be, and not necessarily pursuing that 2 or 4-year degree. And so we also know that we have an opportunity to enter folks into specific pathways, particularly the trades or the fields that are growing. And in Michigan, if you look at the data that just came out, almost all of the job growth is actually happening in healthcare. And so years ago, when we were part of the Harvard Bloomberg program, we were able to convene a table of stakeholders. In particular, we brought forward Henry Ford Community College and Corewell Health. Corewell is actually the largest healthcare system in Michigan. And Henry Ford for years had been trying to get a job guarantee for all of its nursing grads. We actually have the largest associate nursing program in Michigan is actually at Henry Ford Community College. And we also have Corewell Dearborn, which is the 2nd largest flagship hospital for the Corewell system. After a year of negotiations and conversations, we inked a contract, which said every nursing grad that passes the NCLEX upon graduation has a guaranteed job anywhere in any one of Corewell's Southeast Michigan facilities. If there's a sign-on bonus, they're given the sign-on bonus. And whatever that pay rate is at the time, they're given that pay rate. All they have to do is just pass the NCLEX. And then they took it a step further. 50% of your tuition would also be covered if you committed to Corewell in your first year of nursing school. And so they'll pay for your tuition and then guarantee you the job with all the bonuses that come inside of that contract. And it's been extremely successful. And now Corewell and Henry Ford Community College are discussing how do we expand this for x-ray techs, for radiology techs, for nursing assistants, things of that nature, knowing that you have the young folk who we need to employ, and we'd like to eliminate any barrier to get them into the workforce.
So the 4+1 program you mentioned is really interesting because it harkens back to where community colleges came from. They arose in the 1920s because parents were concerned about sending their kids away from high school to college. Yeah. And so it was local school boards that created the first junior colleges. And they were created within mind, transferring folks on to a 4-year degree. What then happened over the, after World War II in particular, was developing that career and technical focus. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the politics of this. When we think about the 4+1 program, what immediately comes to mind is political opposition that might related to the concept of tracking. Are you pushing kids into associate degrees that might be have a BA in their future? On the other side, you now have high schools involved in the workforce development of the region. And that's great, but how do high schools feel about now this extra burden being put on them of doing the career counseling, of thinking about career pathways?
What's unique in Dearborn is because we have one school board that sits above both entities, there's a lot of synergy. And actually, right now we're searching for a new superintendent and a new president for Henry Ford Community College. In fact, if you want to be the state superintendent, you probably want to be Dearborn superintendent, because we've had 3 state superintendents. Ours just became the state superintendent most recently because of the unique challenges that we've been able to overcome. We don't have issues with tracking. Because of a high immigrant population, for us, most of our parents want us to be doctors, lawyers, and engineers. And so anything short of that, you're a failure. My wife is the doctor. Thankfully, she succeeded. In my mother's eyes, I have failed. And just a fun story on that. I first was a state representative before mayor. I was 26. I was the only Muslim of 148 legislators. My mother, who observes the hijab, was on the state capitol floor for my oath. And she was crying. She hugged me and she whispered, she's like, I want you to know I'm very proud of you, but I would have been more proud if you were a doctor. That's a true story. And so we never had that issue with tracking. I think one of the issues we do have is how young should a student be in their first community college course? I was 15 and my first world religions course was the first community college course I enrolled in, and my feet were still dangling in the chair because I wasn't tall enough to touch the floor. And the teacher asked where my mother was, if she was enrolled in the class, and I just happened to be there with her. And so I think that is one of the issues that we have on when to enter the community college world, understanding that you're going to be exposed to a lot more than you would maybe in a more controlled environment in the K-12 system. But for us, I think it's also trying to expand more into the trades. Because we have a mindset of these four-year degrees are really the best opportunities out there. But if you're looking to see where the innovations are coming now within AI, a lot of those jobs are being replaced, at least at the entry level. And where the greatest opportunities lie, and this is true for Ford Motor Company understands this, is really in the trades. And so now what our school system is examining is what does a 3+1 program look like? And so the interim superintendent is working with their administration to explore, can you complete high school in 3 years? And in your 4th year, do an exclusive trades track. So when you graduate then, you can then pursue going to community college to further that trade study, or entering through a union track to complete your trade, whether you're a carpenter, plumber, pipe fitter, whatever it might be. But really trying to reduce the timeline it takes, again, for a person to enter the workforce and a job that's not likely to be replaced in the evolution of technology as we see happening now.
One of the things we've discovered in looking at places that have really excelled in trying to orchestrate local economic development more generally, including the role of workforce development in that process, is the ability to convene important actors within a community. And so that means community colleges or four-year universities that happen to be there. It means the major employers, but it also means other parts of civil society whose voice is important for thinking about the future of a place. Mm-hmm. So with the auto industry, you have an industry that's highly unionized, and so the union voice at the table could be important. I wonder if you could talk a bit about the nature of civil society in Dearborn and the way in which the different actors have worked together and the challenges they may have faced along the way.
You can imagine Local 600 is the largest UAW local in the country, and it's headquartered in the south end of Dearborn. And this represents the locals who are working at the Rouge plant, the infamous Rouge plant, where we're constructing the F-150, America's best-selling pickup truck. At the same time, when a strike happens, you can imagine as a mayor who has strong union ties. My father was a trucker who delivered steel coils for the autos or delivered the F-150 seats. My grandfather worked on the line. So you can imagine when a strike happens, you have such strong ties with the unions. We also need Ford Motor Company to thrive because Ford Motor Company is at the epicenter of the city of Dearborn. And so we have navigated that relationship well. We communicate with both parties. I'm very transparent and outward in my support for our union members in our city. As mayor, we have 16 collective bargaining units within the city, in addition to unions as well. So you have to be able to navigate the politics of each. And ultimately, I should say thankfully, in my tenure, we haven't been at an impasse anywhere where you kind of have to align with one over the other. And Ford, generally speaking, has been the best amongst the big three in its relationship in recent years, and paying its employees the best and working closest with the UAW leadership. And oftentimes, when you talk about the UAW leadership becoming the vice president, typically runs through the Local 600. It's one of the most influential locals. They just became the new Region 1A president, very influential region, and the former Region 1A president just became the vice president. And so a lot of that runs through Dearborn as well. We have very strong union ties. As it pertains to the workforce context, what we see a lack of, though, is a lot of immigrant brown communities in the unions themselves. And so that has been an issue that we have been trying to have conversations with them about getting folks who are in the trades, My father-in-law is a contractor. Many of my aunts and uncles work in the trades, but in a non-unionized environment. Because in Lebanon, there was no union. And so when they come over here, they try to understand what is the purpose of this union, when I'm just trying to remodel this house or remodel whatever it might be. And so we have a lot of education to also do amongst an older community on the importance of maybe joining a union to provide you guaranteed work even in your slow season, or at least provide you some level of income to have a dignified meal on the table at that time as well.
So, a related issue comes with the fact that you have a couple, when it comes to workforce development, you mentioned a Ford Motor Company and then 2 hospital systems. So what you have are 3 employers that have an outsized role in skill development in a place.
Yeah.
There are advantages to that because the negotiations that need to happen are among a smaller group of folks. They're quite invested in the community, so they see their future is tied up. But they also have leverage. Yeah. One of the things that economic research has uncovered in the last 10 years, which we hadn't figured out before, is the power that large employers can exert over local labor markets. So I wonder if you could say a bit just about without putting you too much on the spot, some of the challenges involved, the pluses and minuses, or the challenges and opportunities created by the fact that you've got these big players, but you've got these big players.
Yeah. When you have such large players, and we're 110,000 people, nothing compared to the size of a New York or a Boston or such, you're obviously reliant on a tax base. If Ford goes under, so do your restaurants and cafes and retail that surrounded their headquarters. But the leverage we have really comes in the property tax negotiation aspect. I can tell you, for example, right now, Ford just constructed a brand new world headquarters, 2 million square feet, and it's the most beautiful campus I have laid eyes on, and obviously I'm very biased in my opinions. But they never sought any tax incentives or such prior to construction. So now this one-of-one building is complete, and we have to determine how aggressive we become in the assessing of this building. That's where your leverage comes in. That's where you're able to negotiate collective community agreements, benefit agreements, to determine what is the guaranteed job number that will always be sustained, what happens if it goes below that number, and the things that you can begin to bargain for on maybe a more lenient assessment in exchange for more direct investment in public services across the city. Historically speaking, 50, 60 years ago, Ford used to have its own fire department at the Rouge complex with over 100 firefighters. Then I realized, hey, we don't need to do this, the city should do this. Ford used to provide the city of Dearborn so much in tax resources. The city of Dearborn used to sweep every resident's sidewalks during the summer and then shovel them during the winter. And so I still have residents asking me when we're going to return to shoveling sidewalks in the winter. And I tell them, I don't have that kind of money anymore. But these are opportunities to re-engage in conversations to ensure that the city is also on good financial standing. Because if you talk to any mayor across America, they'd probably tell you that finance is the number one concern that they have. Property taxes go up and down. In Michigan, we have a unique law where during the recession, there was a collapse, obviously, in the value of homes. And then the home value can only increase each year based on inflation or 5%, whichever is less. And so typically what happens is folks who have been in their homes for a longer period of time have far significantly lower property taxes, and all the young people are paying the pop-up tax, which is an average of a 45% increase when they buy that home, making it more unaffordable. And so we have leverage. You have to know when to leverage it, and you also have to know how much to ask for and when not to ask. You don't want to be a parasite onto the large companies where, in this world, in this globalized world, where they feel like they can just take their headquarters and move on elsewhere, who's willing to underwrite their next construction of their billion-dollar warehouse, so on and so forth. World headquarters, excuse me. For us, though, our position is Dearborn is desired because we are the capital of young people. We have more babies per capita right now than any city in all of Michigan. Again, we're 10 years on average younger than the state population. We were the fastest growing city in the state of Michigan. And so while Michigan is having issues with an aging population, Dearborn is having the opposite. Each year we actually been getting 1.5 years younger. And so for a workforce perspective, you want to be near Dearborn. The majority of our residents are willing to travel 15 to 20 minutes to get to work. And so while I'm not trying to convince every Fortune 500 company to move to Dearborn, my argument is if you want a young workforce, you probably want to be within 15 minutes of me, though. And so it's I can't say I've perfected it, but we navigate it as it comes.
As when we've talked to folks who do local economic development, and their job is to go out and recruit companies to come to a place. Talent is the first thing on the list. Yeah. And what do mobile skilled workers care about? They care about the quality of local schools. And that depends on what the tax base looks like. So if you have employers who internalize that, then kind of half the battle is won. But you mentioned public finances, and so I want to hit on this for a moment, because you're a growing city, you're a vibrant city in a state that is not growing as fast. The Upper Midwest has had its challenges for the last 45 years, and what we've seen in terms of the public financing of higher education across the Upper Midwest, and this is really true nationally, that when you get you go through a recessionary period, you get a reduction in funding, you never really return to what funding was before. So as you're now planning for the future, you're reliant on the state for a substantial portion of funding that goes to Henry Ford Community College and to University of Michigan Dearborn. How do you think about the challenges of navigating that forward-looking perspective with a state drag on public finances kind of always in the rearview mirror?
The other component to that is oftentimes the state resources are only used for the operational expenses within a K-12 system or community college. They do not provide you the resources for the infrastructure investment. That's 100% true for K-12. So you get a per pupil fee. For every student you have within your public school system on count day, you're getting a dollar amount from the state. But if you want to update your flailing school system, you have to levy that via property taxes across your city. And so for us, for example, many of our buildings are over 100 years old. There's only so many times you can remodel a boiler system in elementary school. And so we're actually exploring right now today a $1.5 billion bond for our K-12 system to transform it. And the context we had in that conversation with the schools was, if Ford, after 75 years, felt that its existing world headquarters is no longer sufficient for the way in which people work today, given the advancement in technology, why are current school systems and the way that they were designed over 100 years ago still the way that we're trying to educate our children for the jobs of tomorrow? And our community is rallying around this. And so this November, more than likely, we'll be going for a bond to reconstruct the majority of our school system, to deliver that education and hopefully create those workforce pathways in a far more effective way. But the same thing for community college. Right now they have a $4 million levy within the city of Dearborn to help subsidize some of the infrastructure costs, and in exchange the residents get a significantly discounted tuition rate per credit. And so there's always a value offering and a trade-off that's made between the residents and the college.
So I'll drop one more question before we go to questions from the audience, so please be getting ready. And that has to do with the regional economic context in which you find yourself. Yeah. Right next door to Detroit. Detroit has had its challenges for decades now. They're maybe turning a corner in the last bit. There's a lot going on in Detroit. As you think about planning for your economic future, you of course are mindful of the regional economic context. Talk about the ways in which you work with fellow mayors of the surrounding area, the sense of cooperation. What projects do you view as shared among you versus things that are Dearborn's own?
Yeah. Well, for one, I think it's trying to get the appropriate local revenue sharing so we have the resources that we need to fund the public services and the growth that's coming. So that's one thing that we always advocate for, because the first thing that's typically cut at a state budget, having been a state legislator, is local revenue sharing. It's not something very sexy in the media when we talk about cutting local revenue sharing. Most folks don't know what that is versus saying cutting funding to schools or cutting some other projects. So that's one. Two, housing. Housing development is huge. We completed our study. We need 1,500 new units of housing by 2035 in Dearborn. On average, we've only constructed 25 per year each year for the last decade. And so we have to be able to cut a lot of bureaucratic red tape to allow the housing to happen. But in this day and age where housing costs have soared, construction costs, we don't want to give the bag away in terms of property tax abatements and exemptions, because that's our lifeline to fund city services. So we're looking for support from the state of Michigan to help underwrite some of these housing developments. In Dearborn, we do it differently. When we have housing developers who come, we prefer to work with locals. But we also, for example, we just approved a brownfield for a local developer. But what's different in Dearborn is all the units will be our workforce eligible pricing in terms of the rents. But we also said throughout the length of time of the brownfield, you have to sell 45% of your units for home ownership. Understanding that wealth comes from owning the home and not just from renting it for several years. That wealth then just goes to the owner of the parcel. So I think there's a lot of synergy there. Honestly, if I can say lastly, I would say is the more dollars that come to a city, and I'm very biased in this, but the more often times than not that we are going to address the problem. I think that was one of the greatest successes of the American Rescue Plan Act. It was the allocation that cities got across the country, because those closest to the problem are the ones who are going to be closest to the solution. And it is mayors. And I've served in both roles, both legislative and now at the executive at the local level. And so we know what neighborhood roads are damaged, what parks need upkeeping, what community centers we need to provide for our residents to keep up with creating an environment where you can work, live, and play better than anybody else. And so I think the greatest synergy is telling Lansing and the federal government, I might do away with county government altogether. That's cut that out of the video. But sometimes there are just pass-through entities that exist that I think when the resources go down to the local level, you're able to address the issues in a far superior way, from a time perspective, from an efficiency perspective, and bureaucracy is real in government. And I think at a local level, you can strip away a lot of that bureaucracy.
Let's open it up to questions. Please begin by telling us who you are, and please ask a question rather than making a commentary, if you would. Please. And wait for a microphone before beginning to speak.
Hello? Is it on? Yeah.
Yes.
All right. My name's Artemis. I am a first-year MPP student here at the Kennedy School. I'm curious about first of all, thank you for sharing your experience. It was very valuable. When we think of workforce development, we think of education. And I'm curious because you mentioned multiple times that community colleges are where innovation has been shown. And I've heard contradicting opinions from community college school leaders around Massachusetts saying that it's hard to do innovation when there's a lack of resource. So I'm just wondering, has there been particular policies or government programs that you think is most effective in terms of bringing innovation to fruition in community colleges?
Yeah, thank you for that question. What I would say is it really depends on the leadership that you have at the community college and the willingness to make tough things happen. When it came down to creating this guaranteed job opportunity through our Corewell health system, he had reached out to Corewell for 2 years unsuccessfully. We had the power of convening with the Harvard Bloomberg Center and finally brought the stakeholders to the table to ink that contract. But even contract details get, when you get a bunch of attorneys in the room, what doesn't happen is expediency. More bureaucracy just kind of comes. From a funding perspective, this is where we make the argument to our local residents to support a millage, knowing you get a discounted tuition per credit plus the XYZ, the value offerings. And so some communities, right now the 4 mills that our local community college levies is actually the greatest number of mills of any community college in all of Michigan, but also has the smallest taxing authority. And so we understand that trade-off though, but we're getting the greatest benefit for it. And so I think it literally comes down to the leadership and the partnership that exists in navigating some of these political roadways.
Great. Next question.
Is there online?
I've got one coming in online here that has to do with the role for high school dropouts in workforce development. You mentioned the large immigrant population in Dearborn, and if we look nationally, folks are maybe coming from countries in which mandatory schooling is through 9th grade, and going through sophomore, junior, senior of high school, just in terms of what the family views is, is not part of the history.
Yeah.
And the U.S. labor force has been very hard on folks who don't have a high school degree, and also hard on folks who just have a high school degree and not more. So how do we think about that challenge in your context?
Well, the other challenge I would say that's arising now are the predatory online programs that pull children out of our high school program and guarantee a high school diploma in 6 to 9 months. And that's been a great challenge. We're losing a lot of students who think they can get a quality education in 9 months that typically happens over 4 years. For us in Dearborn, we haven't really surmounted that challenge. It doesn't exist to a great degree, largely because of this strong emphasis that education is your pathway to having a dignified job and being able to provide a dignified meal. Obviously, we have a unique population where many folks come from war-torn countries, and what they really want, growing up for me, the saying was 6 figures by 26. That's not a Drake lyric. It was a lyric of a bunch of kids who grew up in working poor families who wanted to have a good paying job. But I think with the emergence of AI, we're going to have to, I really believe the 4-year institutions are going to have the greatest difficulty in pitching their value argument for why a 4-year degree is worth far more than just pursuing a trade path or an associate's with some certificate. When I first got my MPH in epidemiology and biostatistics, what I paid for my degree in my first job was a great multiple of a difference. You have to explain what was that student debt ultimately worth the job opportunity that you're going to land. So I think that is where the greater difficulty is going to come.
Please.
Hello. Thank you for with us. This was really insightful. My name is Noor. I'm a first-year MPP. My background is in labor policy, so I thought this was really great. One of the questions I have for you is, in the context of Dearborn, how do you balance pushing people into these big 3 that you mentioned versus the small and medium-sized enterprises? I know you mentioned high school graduates tend to drop and go into these SMEs, so I'm wondering how you balance the 2 in terms of growth, because particularly at least in Toronto, which is one of my hometowns, SMEs are very common spaces, particularly for immigrant communities. So is that something you see, and how do you strike that balance?
Yeah. The beauty of the mayor of Dearborn is I don't oversee the school system, and we have strong partners there. So we work very closely with the superintendent, the school board, to ensure that students have the best possible future ahead. What I would tell you from a city perspective, what I think is like my job is ensuring that the job opportunities exist for regardless of whatever path you want to pursue across the Dearborn area, or at least in the neighboring area. So when Detroit thrives, Dearborn thrives. Detroit's comeback has also led to a resurgence of people who want to live in a suburban community, maybe not necessarily a fully urban community. And one of the things that we're also focusing on now is not necessarily pursuing the Fortune 100 or 500 companies to relocate, but we have a lot of immigrants who are self-made now, and their companies are 30 minutes out of Dearborn, and we're talking to them about moving their operations to Dearborn. And we are having higher success with them. Some of them are in compound pharmacy, some of them are in medical tech spaces, which are very high-paying jobs. And you do have some special certifications to get there, but they're also willing to pay you to get those certifications. So we're pursuing those employers now to come in. And it really was a learning lesson, because we were pursuing a larger company, and a billionaire out of Detroit came in, gave them some property for free, and they moved to Detroit after we worked for 2 years to try to get them to Dearborn. And so that's one of the problems that you have. And lastly, I would say is you have to have a strong brand. I can't always say that Dearborn's brand has been the strongest. I would say right now that Ford has the strongest brand within the city of Dearborn. Ford, sometimes you'll hear, Carhartt, for example, is a Dearborn company. I don't think most people know that. Hollingsworth is another Dearborn company, but Carhartt will always say it's a Detroit company, because I think the Dearborn brand is not as strong right now. And so we're actually going through a whole remarketing and branding process for Dearborn, because we'd like the Dearborn brand to be stronger than all the entities within Dearborn, because that also will assist you with the recruiting itself.
Want to take a quick question online, and then we'll take some more from the audience. We've got a question coming in from someone who's been working in the context of Lincoln, Nebraska, where there's been a large resettlement of refugees. Mm-hmm. You face this issue of folks who've been accredited in various occupations, often of high status in their countries of origin, and then how do you then navigate that challenge of reinserting them into the local labor force, not just getting local employers to recognize their certifications, but also resistance from the local population in terms of bringing folks in to higher wage jobs.
Yeah, the difficulty here is largely from a state perspective. And so what we have advocated for the longest time are kind of compacts. This also has to deal with people who graduate here who might, who graduate in Minnesota, for example, might want to move to Michigan, or nurses. Well, the nursing certification in Minnesota might not transfer to Michigan so easily. So we've always been strong advocates for compacts where if you have a certification of the same level of vigor in a neighboring country or state, it should be able to transfer in order for you to work appropriately here. We've had this with a lot of physicians in Dearborn. They're physicians overseas, but obviously they have to come back and redo residency to an extent, and landing residency as is, we don't have enough residency slots for medical graduates on an annual basis. And so the federal government needs to add more residency slots. So it's a far more complex issue to resolve. I can tell you a company that does it well is a company called Hollingsworth in Dearborn. It's a manufacturing entity that produces the parts for the big three. They bring in folk at a strong, high-paying entry job, because also knowing language sometimes is a strong barrier. The employees do not need to speak English. All of their managers are multilingual. Every single manager across the whole company. And this is by design. And when we walk through, the majority of the workforce on the line was this high immigrant, high refugee population of folks who did not speak English. But they had a whole program and curriculum created to bring these folks into the workforce right away. Within a matter of 90 days of being in the country, you can get a job and on their line. And so it doesn't speak to the specific specification portion. That's a state and federal issue, which we have to overcome, but at least some folks on the ground are getting it right.
That's very reminiscent of the informal practices for immigrant assimilation into the labor force in the 1890s and early 1900s. Yeah. Because you had an existing set of folks who'd come 10 years before who could then be points of entry, and that powered the US Industrial Revolution. It wasn't official policy, but it ended up being a rock bed of workforce development at the time.
The other thing Dearborn does really well is we're a small business haven. We have a very entrepreneurial mindset in our community. And so if you go through our downtown, you're not gonna find many franchises. I was walking through Cambridge yesterday and everything is a franchise. We probably produce more franchises per capita like you wouldn't believe. I mean, if you're seeing a Yemeni coffee shop open up in a city near you, odds are its headquarters started in Dearborn. And the reason that's the case is when you see let's just say, a kahwa house was the coffee shop, one of the first to start. It's because it's fully vertically integrated, and it's about 10 families who put all their resources together to make this operation a dream. And so the coffee plantation is actually by their fathers and their grandfathers back in Yemen. They are the ones who are harvesting the coffee bean, bringing it over, and then 10 families came together, opened up the operation in Dearborn. And Kahwa House now, has 2 locations in Dearborn, but it has 150 in the pipeline across the world. Haras Coffee is the second one. He has 50 locations already open across the country, with 200 already signed and dotted. And now they're opening up their headquarters in Dearborn. So one coffee shop is now a 70,000 square foot headquarters, and you're seeing all these small businesses erupt. It's because we have this mentality in Dearborn that we can all come together, put in a little bit of resources. Maybe you have a smaller slice of a bigger pie, but we have a lot of folks entering this space, and we're really proud of it.
That touches on a question I'll ask in just a second about fostering entrepreneurship. But we had a question from the audience.
Thanks. Kirill Borusiak, Assistant Professor of Economics at Berkeley, visiting Kennedy School. So thanks, Mayor Hammoud, for the thoughts. I'm curious how you're thinking about out-migration from Dearborn. Like, when you create these pipelines from like high school to community college and so on, you're sort of keeping people in the town, in the city, which I understand is good for taxes and jobs and everything, but also like potentially maybe the best future for those young people is somewhere else. Like, how do you feel about this, and how much of a problem is out-migration?
Well, the best future for young people is in Dearborn. Dearborn is a unique place. 110,000 would be considered a mid-sized city, but we have very much a small town feel. There are not many communities where you can go to where every CEO that's in Dearborn is willing to help every young person in Dearborn. But we have that culture that we've created in Dearborn. If you need a job at a Fortune 500, whatever it might be, we probably know somebody that we'll connect you with to help you get that interview or land that relationship. And so out-migration is not a real thing. I mean, the only person who migrated out of my family, I have a brother who lives in Tustin, California. He regrets it every day. But his wife was out there. She lived out there when he first met her, and he's been out there. But now he's looking at 6 months a year in Michigan potentially. And I have a sister in a city called Canton, which is 15 minutes out of Dearborn. It's because she couldn't find a house in Dearborn. And since they got married a year ago, they've been looking for a house in Dearborn ever since. And so for us, there is a sustainable growth that we'd like. A lot of our young people graduate. If you're going to University of Michigan Dearborn, Hunter Ford College, 80% of them stay in Dearborn, which we really love. And that's why we tell all major employers, if you want young people, come within the proximity of Dearborn. We've kind of coined the Metro Dearborn area. If you got a Yemeni coffee shop or Arab grocery store, you're probably in the Metro Dearborn area because they're expanding across that region. But you're going to lose some folk. It's the truth. They'll come to the East Coast. You know, we call Harvard the Michigan of the East. And so they're going to come to the East Coast. It's going to happen. But I can tell you, like with some of my directors, Mariam Jalul is a Harvard grad. And she was on Capitol Hill with AOC at the time, and we recruited her to come back to be our chief strategy officer in Dearborn. Ali Abazid was my public health director. He was at the NIH in DC. We recruited him to come back, and they all wanted to help build up Dearborn. And they actually all purchased homes in Dearborn now. And so I think there's a unique narrative to Dearborn that you don't find elsewhere, specifically in immigrant communities. You know, there's a family-like atmosphere.
Hi, my name is Margot. Thank you so much for coming. I wonder how Dearborn is thinking about some of the changes in federal higher education policy over the past year, specifically workforce Pell, but then also some of the rollbacks in gainful employment.
It's difficult to go to medical school when you have a cap on the amount of loans you can now pull. And so I haven't had to reckon with any of those changes just yet. I think a lot of it's started to come into fruition. You know, for us, the larger federal policy that we keep our mind of is, you know, we don't have many undocumented immigrants in Dearborn, but we have a lot of folks on visas. But if you begin to subjectively cancel those visas, you then create an undocumented population. And those are the challenges that we currently have to surmount. And we're working by building regional partnerships with a lot of civil rights organizations, a lot of local municipalities, and a lot of major corporations who understand that they have a large immigrant workforce that is here legally. Unfortunately, though, you have a lot of actions being taken based on where this population has migrated from. And so those are the challenges that we're currently navigating in real time.
Question, please.
Hi, I'm Jesse, MPP1 from Wilmington, North Carolina. When we talk about a resilient workforce, we need jobs, but we also need those jobs to be well-paying and maybe an opportunity to improve socioeconomic status. And sometimes those things are in contrast, right? Improving the number of jobs and the quality of jobs. How do you think about that and striking the right balance?
From a city's perspective, one is working in tangent with the state. I'm a big opponent of when the state provides these large subsidies to these larger corporations who are creating jobs that essentially keep you in poverty. You know, this factory is going to get, you know, $5 billion. And in my mind, I'm like, if you just gave the $5 billion to the people, they'd get paid more than going to work for this company. And so that's why I have been, our economic development team is now retooled. We have a few components. One, we have a team of business liaisons whose job is to never be at City Hall. They go out and visit small businesses every single day, ask them what they need to expand, to add a second location. We provide facade improvement grants up to $200,000. We have Nights of Innovation every May where we offer grants for tech innovators and things of that nature. But secondly, while we've been recruiting these self-made millionaires in Dearborn, recruiting their high-paying jobs and entities in nearby cities back to relocate to Dearborn. Because Dearborn does have a higher graduation rate in high school, a higher pursuance rate amongst immigrant communities for four-year degrees. In fact, like Muslim women are one of the highest educated class of people in all of Dearborn and all of the country. And so we want those jobs relocated close to Dearborn. And sometimes it's folks that we know through a phone call or two, and we have the leverage to bring them over. Like I'll call somebody's father to get their son to move their company to Dearborn. You know, I use my brown man method sometimes, you know. But you also have to push back on the state, because whenever you talk to large corporations, when it comes to tax breaks is like the number 7 thing that they're actually looking for. The top 2 tend to be talent and infrastructure. You know, it's strange to me that Ford is building its world headquarters Never got any tax incentives, which is kudos to Ford. But what it saw dollars for was to fix Oakwood Boulevard, which is a county road right in front of it. And they actually put up some of its own resources to reconstruct that road. Again, kudos to Ford Motor Company. That doesn't happen often. And so the state has to be also focused on the right path. And I think Columbus, Ohio, and I hate to say that as a Michigan guy, does it fairly well in terms of the corporations that they recruit in the knowledge sector, high-paying jobs, high-skilled jobs that aren't replaceable by AI right now. And we have to do a better job of it in Michigan.
We've got a couple questions online specifically about AI. Economists face these questions 75 times a day, mainly from my family members who call in the morning and at night, like, what is AI going to do to my economic future?
Yeah.
And I tell them in all honesty, the absolute best economic thinking about this is that we have no idea.
Correct. Yeah.
So, but it's your job to think about the future.
Yeah.
You have the advantage, with the automobile industry and with healthcare, probably not the front lines of AI disruption, but we don't know what that disruption is going to look like. So, how are you thinking about the AI workforce connection in your planning for Dearborn?
Well, one, from a city government perspective, the public sector tends to lag behind an innovative in tech. And so that's something that we have not done with the emergence of AI. And so we actually have AI deployed in a multitude of ways across the city. AI handles about 35% of all the incoming calls now. Does that mean that we've laid off our customer service reps? No. They now have more time to handle the far more difficult calls that come in. They can take their time with it, knowing that AI is handling the lower hanging fruit, kind of to say. AI is helping us and bridge the communication gap that exists between residents and employees. Not all my employees are multilingual, but you can talk to our chatbot now, and if Arabic is the language you're most comfortable with, you speak in Arabic, it translates real time to English to the customer service rep. They communicate back in English and translates real time back to you in Arabic. So those are innovations that we like. You see emergence of AI in public safety, and you're going to see AI disrupt your planning and zoning departments. There are tools now where you can submit site plans for review. AI can bounce it against your code of ordinances and letting you know how many violations you have prior to submission. So it'll decrease, hopefully, the site plan review time. Can it replace planners in the future? I have no idea. I think what we're trying to do from a city perspective is work with our schools in particular, and Ford Motor Company's invested in this, on creating these pathways to the trades. I think everybody that you speak with on AI, and most of us who have our answers, ask ChatGPT, what's happening to the future because of AI? So we're all asking AI for the solution when it's probably the problem. And so we're trying to create these pathways in the trades, knowing that these are high-paying jobs. You become an electrician or a plumber making 6 figures out the gate if you're working overtime with no debt to your name. That's a great value to so many of us. And because Dearborn is a capital of young people, everybody's invested in this. And so that's what we're trying to do. I think we're going to have to surmount this challenge from the federal and state government when it comes to job replacement, especially in the transportation industry. If it's truck drivers or autonomous vehicles, you're going to have a great layoff. And makes you think Andrew Yang was talking about this in the presidential trail, and everybody thought he was crazy. But here we are just a few years later.
We didn't get time to get to this, but I just wanted to call out what you were saying about immigrant communities and entrepreneurship. And a challenge that many communities face is, how do you finance this stuff? Where you have strong collections of families and strong communities there where people have confidence in to invest in each other, you solve that finance problem, which is incredibly important. So just wanted to call out as part of your special sauce as something that really resonated. Mayor Hammoud, this has been fantastic. Really impressed by what you're doing in Dearborn, and delighted that you've connected with the Bloomberg Center, and look forward to more opportunities to learning about all the innovative stuff that you guys are doing. Thank you very much.
Thank you.